In the flickering light of a clay oil lamp, a young girl with narrow fingers and silent steps knelt before her mother's linen basket. The year was somewhere around 1200 BCE, and the air in Thebes was still and heavy with dust. Her name was Henu. It meant to offer praise, but Henu did not speak often. Her work was to stitch. You are sitting next to her, if you like, at the edge of a shadowy mud brick courtyard with palm fronds rustling faintly above. The heat is thick, but your body has grown used to it. The linen smells faintly of embalming, oils, dried natron, and crushed lotus. Henu's mother was a textile servant of the dead, a title that sounds grander than it was. In truth, she spent her days dyeing linen strips and sewing shrouds for the newly embalmed, one stitch per breath of the soul. Every noble corpse needed preparation, and every preparation required silence, patience, and an odd kind of reverence. Though women were not permitted into the burial chambers themselves, their hands were everywhere, working in small courtyards and shaded rooms, bending over looms and bundles of white cloth. Henu's job: to finish her mother's work when her mother could no longer see by lamplight. She did not mind. Henu found a rhythm in her stitches, a kind of wordless chant in the act of pulling thread through fine weave cloth. She knew the ritual cuts in: the linen, the tear at the shoulder, the knot at the ankle, the carefully stitched falcon feathers that ran along the chest for wealthier mummies. She knew not to ask about the locks of hair tucked into the folds, or the amulets sewn near the heart. Then, one day, her mother handed her an old wooden sewing kitit's lid carved with faint hieroglyphs of the goddess Nephthys. It had belonged, she said, to her grandmother, or perhaps her grandmother's grandmother. The age was unclear. But what was clear, so very clear, was that the box had not been opened in decades. Henu opened it quietly, the hinges sighing like tired reeds. Inside, a few bone needles, curled from time and sand, spindles of linen thread, yellowed like old teeth, and beneath them, wrapped in brittle papyrus, was something she had never seen before: tiny sketches, diagrams, not of sewing, but of tomb objects, chairs, sandals, ceremonial fans, notes in a faded script explaining how each item should be folded, in cloth, wrapped in specific herbs, or stitched with protective symbols. They were instructions, not for sewing garments, but for sewing a person into the afterlife. You pause with her as she stares. The air feels suddenly colder. The ancient Egyptians believed the body had to be whole and complete for the soul to navigate the afterlife. But what if something had been forgotten? A charm sewn in the wrong place? A fold misaligned? Would the soul wander? Would it stumble? Henu stared down at the diagrams, brow furrowed. There were no names, no signatures, just fragments. But one note in particular, scrawled with urgency, stood out: wrap the breath in linen, stitch it behind the tongue. What did it mean? That night she did not sleep. She sat under the papyrus canopy, the sewing kit in her lap, and stared at the thread between her fingers. If she could read more of the notes, she might understand. But the ink was flaking, the papyrus dry as dust. She tucked it away and returned to stitching, though her thoughts now wandered with every knot she tied. She began to sew, differently, subtly mirroring what she had seen in the diagrams. A stitch here, a bend there. Her mother did not notice, or perhaps she did, but said nothing. The dead would not complain. The priests would not inspect. One morning, a funeral procession came to their courtyard. A young noblewoman, barely older than Henu, her body stiff with oils and wrapped in layers of fine linen. The family wept. The priests chanted. Henu was asked to help finish the outer wrap, her fingers moving fast and sure as she worked. She slipped a charm into the fold, just as the old note had said, a charm for breath, behind the tongue. And then she saw something odd. The noblewoman's lips were parted, slightly, not in pain or death, but ... in relief. As if something forgotten had returned to her. Henu stepped back. Her heart beat faster. It was just a trick of embalming, a shift in the resin. But still, she felt it an echo. What secrets had these stitches carried through the ages? How many women had known about them, who had first written those notes? And what else might be hidden inside that old sewing kit? The heat rises again around you. The thread in her hands looks like the line between life and death, and somewhere beneath the earth, a soul might be whispering thanks for a single, careful stitch. By the following week, the papyrus scrolls inside the sewing kit had begun to crumble at the edges. Henu learned to unwrap them, slowly using the steam from a hot cloth to soften the dry layers. The way her mother softened ancient wrappings. She worked only at night, alone under the eaves. When the world was asleep and the stars blinked quietly above Thebes, there was no one to ask about the scrolls. The old women in the textile house knew songs and patterns, but they did not speak of instructions like these. The priests recited from scrolls of their own strict funeral rites, formulas to ensure safe passage to the field of reeds. But these were different. These notes came not from temple ritual, but from the hands of women who worked in the shadows, whose careful stitches guided souls in silence. One brittle page held a hand-drawn outline of a body, not unlike the ones she had seen on temple walls. But here, the limbs were labeled not with names of gods, but with verbs. Fasten breath, it said near the ribs. Tie memory, it read beneath the eyes, and near the hands, braid deeds. There was something deeply human in it. Not grand, not priestly, just ... practical, like a checklist for eternity. Henu wondered whether this was once common knowledge. Had women long ago known how to sew memory into the dead? Was this a forgotten craft? She looked at her own needle and thought of her ancestors' generations of mothers, aunts, and daughters who had worked these same threads. The act of wrapping a body was no small thing. First, the corpse was purified. Then the fingers were wrapped, each separately. Then the toes. The arms were crossed, the eyes closed, the tongue folded gently inside the mouth. For noblemen, golden amulets were placed beneath the tongue symbol of speech in the afterlife. But what if the stitch itself could carry that power? One scroll described a very peculiar item, a breathcloth cut from a mother's robe and soaked in myrrh. It was to be sewn behind the upper palate, hidden between layers of wrappings. If done properly, the soul would be able to whisper the right name when it reached the gates of the underworld. That night, Henu prepared one, quietly, without telling her mother, a fragment of her own linen sash, not for a noble, not for a priest, but for a child and infant girl who had died from the river's fever and been brought to them for burial. The family was poor. There would be no offerings, no gold, no fanfare, but Henu did not believe the gods cared for wealth. She sewed the breathcloth behind the infant's tongue, knotting it with a prayer she didn't quite understand. Then she folded, the jaw closed, and in the silence that followed, the stillness was ... different. She began to feel a pull, not fear, but curiosity. How far back did these instructions go? What had the first soul stitchers known? You and Henu walk. One morning to the market. Thebes is humming with life. Donkeys bray near the pottery stalls, and the scent of fish and beer thickens the air. Henu turns into a shaded lane you've never noticed before. It leads to an old scribe's shop, one she's passed many times without entering. Today she steps inside. The scribe is ancient, with papyrus-dry skin and cloudy eyes. He does not look up, even when she speaks. I have something, Henu says, her voice barely more than a thread. She unwraps a corner of the scroll. The scribe's fingers twitch. He touches the brittle sheet with reverence, tracing the hieratic script. This is not priest's work, he murmurs. This is older. Older than what? She asks. Older than rules, he says. Older than temples. This is grandmother's magic. He tells her a story, not written in any scroll, not taught in schools. He says there were women before the gods were formalized, women who understood that the soul was not just a name, but a pattern, that memory lived not in the heart, but in the cloth that touched the skin. They had no temples. Their rites were done in kitchens, in wells, in childbirth beds. Their tools were needles, not knives. These women believed that forgetting was death. So they stitched memory. But it was lost, he says, or hidden, or buried under the weight of priests. Henu returns home shaken. That night she can't sew. She lies awake, the box beside her, and wonders if she's trespassing into something sacred or something dangerous. The next burial brings a request from a high official's wife. Her husband, a man of status and cruelty, is to be buried in a white shroud stitched with the eye of Horus. Henu is given the task. As she sews, she hesitates. What if this man does not deserve safe passage? What if the stitch is more than a ritual? What if it actually works? But she cannot ask. She sews the eye carefully, as ordered. Yet at the final fold, she slips the breathcloth into the wrong place, near the stomach, not the mouth. A subtle rebellion no one notices. The wife weeps with appropriate formality. The priests chant, but Henu watches the body disappear into the tomb and wonders, will he reach the field of reeds, or will he wander, nameless? Days pass. The scrolls decay further. She copies some notes onto fresh papyrus, but her ink is weak and her script untrained. Still, she tries. She dreams of women sewing under the stars, of souls rising from linen, of mouths stitched shut and tongues wrapped in gold. She dreams of a temple with no doors, only threads. Her mother grows ill, a slow wasting. Her hands shake, her eyesight fades. She no longer stitches. One morning, she calls Henu to her side. Did you open the old kit? She asks. Henu nods. Her mother does not scold, only says, then you must remember. What we do with cloth is not just for burial. It is memory. It is protection. We hold the dead in our hands. That evening, Henu wraps her mother's loom with a gesture of respect, a way to say goodbye. But in the back of her mind, one question hums like a restless fly. What happens when a soul is sown wrong? The Nile ran lower that season. Crops were late, and the sun refused to retreat even after nightfall. Everything in Thebes felt dry air, dry fields, dry hope. But Henu's hands never stopped moving. Her mother's decline had been quiet, but steady, a gentle unraveling. By the time the sun reached its highest point during the festival of Opet, she no longer rose from bed. Henu washed her skin with hibiscus water, combed her grey-streaked hair, and sang to her with the same lullabies once hummed into her own childhood dreams. One dusk, as the heat finally dipped and the first evening stars trembled into view, her mother whispered a final request. "Wrapped me like I showed you, but use the thread with the yellow dye, that one feels warm, like home." Henu nodded through tears. That thread had always been her mother's favorite, dyed from safflower petals, stored in a narrow jar that smelled of red oil and lemon bark. It had never been used for the dead before. But then again, this wasn't just any burial. When her mother passed 2 days later, Henu stitched in silence. No priests, no ceremonial songs, just linen, thread, and memory. She slipped a folded message behind her mother's tongue. Not a prayer, not a hymn, but a personal note. "You taught me the weight of cloth. I will carry it now." She tied the jaw closed, layered her mother's arms across her chest, folded the body like a precious gift for the next world, and then she stitched. But this time, it was not only ritual. She stitched in symbols known only to the soul stitchers, the old women from forgotten generations who had once passed these secrets hand to hand, daughter to daughter. Her fingers moved as if guided by someone else. By dawn, the wrappings were complete, and her mother looked at peace, not just laid to rest, but truly resting, as if her soul had already begun to drift gently toward the field of reeds. The days afterward were quiet. The workshop was still. Clients came, but Henu took few commissions. Most came from far outside Thebes, now travelers, merchants, strangers who heard whispered rumors of the girl who sews for the soul. They brought odd requests: a wrap for a grandmother who died without speaking, a ribbon to lay in a warrior's fist, a blanket for an infant never named. Sometimes they asked her to include pieces of old tunics, lockets of hair, dried petals, notes written in secret ink. She honored every request. One day, an old woman arrived. She wore an amulet shaped like a tiny boat and spoke with an accent from the eastern desert. "I heard you can stitch the forgotten back into memory," the woman said. "Is it true?" "I don't know," Henu replied. "I only do what the cloth tells me." The woman smiled. "Then you've learned the true language." She handed Henu a strip of linen so old it crackled. "This was my sister's. She died young. We could never bury her properly. I want her to find her way now." As Henu worked, the needle moved easily as if the thread already knew the path. With every loop, she felt the presence of something larger than grief, older than loss. It was comfort, connection, a thread not just between body and soul, but between past and present, between sisters, between generations, between all the women who had ever sewn their love into cloth. One night, the box, the one she had found in the noblewoman's chest so long ago, cracked open at the hinges. Inside, tucked behind the lining, was a final piece of papyrus, faded, fragile, but legible. It read, "To stitch the soul is to tether it gently to what matters, not to bind but to remind, a breath behind the tongue, a deed beneath the hands, a name folded near the heart. These are the things that survive the fire of death." Henu wept when she read it. She had not imagined this power. It was real, and now she would carry it forward. Years passed. Thebes changed. Dynasties shifted. Floods came and went. But Henu's home remained. By then she was no longer a girl, but a woman with fine lines around her eyes and thread-calloused fingers. She taught others quietly, only those who came with patience, not ambition. She made no temple, She wore no priest's robes, but people traveled far to bring their dead to her. Some left feathers, others spices, others tiny carved animals. Each person hoped, in their own way, to be remembered just a little longer, to carry something of themselves into whatever came. Next, Henu never promised salvation, but she offered what no priest could: a stitch in the place where grief lived, a fold where breath once warmed, a memory tucked into the quiet, and somehow that was enough. On the final evening of her own life, Henu lay beneath the same wooden eaves where she once unrolled the first scrolls. The stars were visible through the lattice. The Nile, now low and slow, reflected their shimmer. She held a single strip of yellow thread in her palm. A young girl, a weaver she had taught, sat beside her. "Wrap me like I wrapped my mother," Henu whispered, "but sew this near my heart. Let the thread remember." The girl nodded, holding back tears, and when the final stitch was done, when Henu's breath had faded and her eyes closed for the last time, the room was filled with empty but full, as if something had gently passed through. Not gone, just ... folded into the fabric of forever. How a mortal girl taught Artemis to whisper, the girl who walked quietly in a village pressed between the silver olive foothills of Arcadia and the murmur of a meandering stream. There lived a girl named Lysandra. She was no one special by the standards of legend. Her family tilled fields, her hands were calloused from threshing barley, and her feet bore the thick skin of a life lived without sandals. No temples were raised in her honor. No statues bore her likeness. But if you had asked the oldest goat herder or the blind weaver near the market's edge, they might have remembered a tale, barely a whisper, about the girl who walked too quietly, in a time where the gods often screamed their will from mountain tops and sent thunder to make themselves heard. Lysandra did something rather revolutionary. She listened. You would not have noticed her at first. She rose before dawn, stirred the hearth, folded her younger brother's blankets, and began her daily chores without a sound. Even the chickens did not flap at her approach. She moved like shadow and settled into the folds of the world with such gentleness that many forgot she was there at all. Her mother worried. A girl like that wouldn't bring a dowry. A girl like that would be mistaken for a shade something half dead, half forgotten. "Speak up, child," her mother often chided. The gods do not bless the meek. But Lysandra was not meek. She simply found more wonder in the hush of the forest than in the clamor of the agora. In the midday heat, she would wander up the hillside where the shepherds dared not go, and there she'd sit under the same ancient cypress that whispered down to her like an old friend. There, among the slow insects and lazy haze, she began to notice things others didn't. The bees told time. The moss grew in spirals where deer had nested. The owls blinked twice before the wind shifted. To most villagers, the forest was background. To Lysandra, it was narrative. The stories of Artemis, goddess of the hunt, were familiar to her. Every child knew of the silver-bowed virgin who raced through the trees, her feet barely skimming the undergrowth. But to Lysandra, Artemis was not the tempest of wrath or the thundering protector of wild things that priests described in temples. She was a hush of silence more sacred than any prayer. One late evening, Lysandra followed a trail left by soft hooves and broken mint stems. It led to a glade no one in the village had spoken of. No sacred stones, no nymph-carved altars, just a curve of earth that smelled of time and carried the distant sound of a doe breathing. There, the wind stopped. Lysandra held her breath, and then she saw her, not the blinding vision of a god in divine fury, but something than mortal, yes, with eyes the color of dusk-shadowed heather and skin like moonlight caught in linen. Artemis stood not with posture of dominance, but with stillness like a deer watching a hunter decide. She was listening, and that's when Lysandra, without understanding why, did not bow, did not scream or flee or fall to her knees. She simply sat down, palms to the earth, and offered her silence as tribute to the goddess of wildness. The loud were always obvious. It was the quiet ones, those who could hear the leaves tell time and who walked without ripples that intrigued. Her the moment passed. No thunder cracked, no great voice spoke, but Artemis remained, not speaking, not moving. Lysandra closed her eyes. She could feel the weight of the goddess's attention, like a warm pelt placed gently over her shoulders. It was not worship, it was recognition. From that day on, Lysandra changed. The villagers noticed goats came easier to her. The well, dry for weeks, bubbled slightly when she drew water. Her mother stopped asking her to speak louder. The girl, who walked too quietly, had become a vessel of something else, something slower, older, and sometimes, after dusk, if you stood by the edge of the woods, you might hear two voices, one young, one eternal, not speaking, but breathing together. Did Artemis teach the girl something that day? Or had she learned, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to be truly seen in stillness? In the days and weeks that followed Lysandra's silent meeting with Artemis, her life remained largely the same, at least on the surface. She still rose before the sun, still wove baskets from reeds, and still watered the fig tree near her, family's crumbling wall, but the stillness around her had deepened. People began stepping aside for her, not out of fear, but uncertainty, like they were avoiding a memory they couldn't quite place. Lysandra herself felt it most in her fingertips, when she traced the bark of an old olive tree or gathered herbs. From the rocky soil, her hands tingled. She could sense when a storm was due, not by clouds or wind, but in the sluggish breath of the grass. Her senses had become attuned to the very slowness of the earth. She returned, almost without thought, to the glade where she had seen Artemis. But the goddess was not there. Not in the way mortals imagine gods, no thunderous arrival, no trail of silver mist. Instead, what greeted Lysandra was absence, a purposeful one, the sort that lingers after a sacred thing has passed through. She sat, listened. The longer she stayed, the more the grove seemed to hum, not with music, but with memory. She heard things that hadn't happened yet, leaves preparing to fall, seeds preparing to split. Even her own breath seemed like it was borrowed from some older silence. Days blurred. She found herself returning again and again, slipping into the forest after chores were done, each visit longer than the last. Her mother no longer asked where she went. The villagers whispered that she had become a wood spirit's bride, or perhaps bewitched by dryads, but no one followed. Not because they feared gods, but because the quiet that surrounded Lysandra had begun to press inward like fog. It made men restless. Children fidgeted in her presence. Even dogs gave her a respectful berth. Then, one dusk, as Lysandra traced her way back to the grove, she noticed something strange. The birds had stopped singing. Every branch was still. No owl hooted, no cicada sped. The air thickened like cooled. Waxed at the heart of the grove, she found something new. A large stone basin, carved so finely it seemed as though no tool had touched it. Around its rim were etched symbols, not language, but forms resembling animal prints. moon phases, and curling water reeds. It was not there before, and yet it felt ancient. Lysandra approached. Inside the basin was water still as glass. When she leaned over it, her reflection flickered. Not with her face, but with Artemis's. Only this time the goddess spoke. Her voice did not enter Lysandra's ears. It bypassed sound altogether, settling somewhere in her chest, beneath her ribs, next to her breath. You hear the world, girl, but you have not yet listened to yourself. Lysandra blinked. The voice was not commanding. It was patient, even curious, like a deer observing a fawn take its first steps. She wanted to speak back, to ask questions, but no sound came, not from her mouth, not from her thoughts, and yet she understood. This basin was no mere altar. It was a place of reflection, not just literal, but spiritual. It showed the listener not who they were, but what they carried. When she looked again, the water rippled. Images danced, her mother's worn hands, her brother's laughter, the slow pain of hunger, the ache of always being unnoticed. Then the images changed: foxes nesting, trees growing in spirals, a deer licking a newborn fawn. Her world and the wild world were braided together. There is power in stillness, came Artemis's voice again. But you must choose, speak and be heard, or remain silent and see. It was not a warning. It was a choice that night. Lysandra did not return home. She built a small shelter in the grove, using branches and woven leaves. She drank from the stream and foraged for mushrooms, chestnuts, and wild figs. The animals accepted her. A hare once dozed near her fire. A fox watched her sleep. And over time, others came, not many, but a few shepherd boys who had lost sheep, widows who wandered too far from the village, one girl who claimed to dream of a pale woman with a bow. They arrived, confused or frightened, and Lysandra greeted them not with words, but with a place to rest. In silence, she offered warmth. In quiet, she became guide, protector, and listener. One evening, as stars thickened over the treetops, a child asked her, "Are you a priestess?" Lysandra shook her head. "But you talk to the goddess," the girl insisted. Lysandra smiled. "Gently, I listen." The girl looked confused. "And she talks back." Lysandra pointed to the wind rustling through the reeds, to the owl watching from a branch, to the heartbeat thudding in the child's chest. "She's always speaking," Lysandra said at last, her voice hoarse from disuse. For a long time, the grove remained untouched by time. No village encroached. No altar was built. Lysandra grew older. Her hair darkened with streaks of silver, but her feet remained bare. Her eyes sharper. She no longer needed to speak to be understood. The grove had become a sanctuary, not one of gold or marble, but of breath and earth. It was Artemis's temple, though no one dared call it that. But one year, change came, not in fire or storm, but in something far more permanent. People. A priest from the coast arrived, wearing linen dyed deep purple, trailing a small retinue of scribes and architects. He had heard rumors of a holy woman, a forest prophetess, whose silences healed madness and whose touch cured boils. He saw the grove, he saw its purity, and he wanted to build a temple. Lysandra stood before him, small and quiet. He explained his plans: columns, altars, incense, processions. She said nothing. Surely, he said, the goddess would prefer marble over moss. Lysandra's silence deepened. That night, the grove whispered louder than it ever had. the silence that moved mountains. The priest did not understand silence as worship. To him, reverence was a matter of spectacle flame, chanting, the weight of stone raised toward heaven. He spoke of donors, inscriptions, and how the goddess's name would echo through the marble halls for 1,000 years. But the grove had its own memory. That night, long after the priest and his men retired to their linen tents at the forest's edge, the wind stirred, not in anger, but in sorrow. Leaves whispered in voices not heard since the time of Titans. The owl hooted once, then stopped. Even the stream that had gurgled through the grove for centuries ran still. Lysandra sat cross-legged at the basin. The surface reflected no stars, no sky only, the shapes of lives not yet lived. She did not move, nor pray aloud. She simply waited, and Artemis came, not as a maiden with arrows, not even in form, but in sensation, the press of the earth, the hush of breath in the reeds, the invisible line that trembles between predator and prey. The goddess had no need to announce herself any more. Lysandra was already listening. He will build it, the voice said, quieter than a sigh. And in time they will come, not to me, but to stone. Lysandra closed her eyes. Then let them. It wasn't defiance, it was knowing. Gods are not unchanging. They, too, shift with the world. Artemis paused, her voice lingering like moonlight. And you, I will listen, Lysandra said. Until even the stone learns to whisper. There was a long silence after that. And then, as if the goddess had nodded without needing form, the stillness folded back into the world the next morning. The priest's workers began clearing trees. A single pine resisted, its roots so deep no oxen could dislodge it. They left it alone. Then they laid the foundations, carving the sacred symbols they had copied from the basin. They brought in white marble from the coast and dyed cloth from Sidon. They placed gold bowls near the entrance and burned cedar oil until it soaked the ground. People came, they knelt on stone. They sang hymns that echoed into the hills. They gave offerings of honey, milk, silver pins, and still the grove remained beside the temple, touched, quiet, except for the occasional rustle of a deer or the hush of a girl's footsteps. For Lysandra never left. She did not enter the temple. She did not tell the pilgrims where to bow. She simply sat beneath the same olive tree, listening. Over years, children began to come again. They crept through the edge of the grove, finding her sitting by the stone basin, hair white now, hands veined and still. She offered them silence, and in it they found comfort. One girl came every full moon. She never spoke, only handed Lysandra a small wildflower, dandelions, crocuses, tiny blue hyacinths. Each time Lysandra smiled, and that was enough. The girl grew older. Her mother died in childbirth, her father in war. She brought her grief to the grove and left it in the hush beneath the trees. When she finally spoke again, her voice was no longer cracked. It was calm, like a forest just before snow. People noticed. The temple remained, growing larger, more ornate. Priests changed robes, names were carved into stone. But still, the faithful wandered into the grove, uncertain why they came or what they sought. Some stayed hours, some only moments, but all left changed, and slowly, over decades, a rumor returned, not of a priestess or prophetess, but of a place where Artemis still listened, a grove that whispered answers without asking questions, a stone basin that did not reflect your face. But your truth, Lysandra, when her breath finally faded beneath the olive tree, was buried beneath the pine no oxen had moved. The children placed pebbles around her roots. No statue was made. No hymns were written. But the wind still passes through the grove in a hush too intentional to be random. And sometimes, on the stillest nights, when the moon is just a sliver and the owls keep their silence, you might feel it too. The quiet recognition of a goddess learning to whisper. How a Mari girl painted stories on her paddle. The quiet currents of Wakatupu Inlet. Morning mist settled low across Wakatupu Inlet, silvering the water until sea and sky were indistinguishable. Beneath the hush of gull cry and the far-off thump of tides, a slender Wakatiwai no broader than a fisherman's arm span nudged gently against a sandbank. Its single passenger, a girl named Kiri, balanced barefoot on the damp timbers, paddle tucked beneath one elbow, brush held in the steady grip of her right hand. Kiri was perhaps 13 summers old enough to braid her hair without help, old enough to fetch pee-pee from the shallows, not yet old enough to speak at the elders' fire. By village reckoning, she was ordinary, daughter of a carver, niece of a flax-weaver, cousin to boys already, learning the rhythm of tire-hard drills. But there was one way in which she differed. Kiri looked at plain wood and did not see emptiness. She saw a waiting story. You stand beside her now. If you wish ankles cooled by inlet water, toes pressing the soft mud that smells of shell and salt, her waka rocks with each ripple. Overhead, the dawn light is still muted, but hints of kauai yellow rise in the east. The inlet's glassy surface is perfectly still, punctured only by occasional rings where tiny fish break for insects. Kiri lowers her paddle across the gunnels. The blade is unadorned kamarahu, timber smoothened by her father's adze, sanded with shark skin until it carries the faint sheen of drift-polished stone. Weeks ago, when her father declared the paddle ready enough for any tide, Kiri had asked if she might decorate it. He shrugged. Hey, aha. If the stories stay true, the paddle will still float. Meaning, a painted paddle would neither ruin nor improve its purpose, so long as the stories matched the truth of the inlet. In this place, truth and story were not separate things. She dips a slim brush of albatross feather into a small gourd of pigment red ochre, crushed with shark liver oil. The hue is deep and rusty, older than bone. She starts near the paddle's tip, guiding the feather in a slow spiral, following the curve of the grain. The shape is not random. It echoes the koru of unfurling fern, symbol of new life. Each narrow curl therefore nods both to the tight coil of a ponga frond and to the whirling currents that ferry young flounder beneath her boat. Her strokes are deliberate but unhurried. The inlet has no clock. The only way to mark time here is the rise and fall of tide and the changing tone of birdsong. From the sand, spit a heron croaks its displeasure at the light. Somewhere inland, beyond stands of kahikatea, a pair of tui have begun their liquid chatter. Kiri works until the first kuru is finished, then sits back on her haunches, letting the paint breathe. The paddle, now half red, half raw wood, rests across her knees like a sleeping eel. The village and its small routine's curious home Palai's a short walk inland, tucked against a slope where kumara mounds soak up north sun. Its palisades are modest, sharpened manuka trunks lashed with harakek, sturdy enough to hold back the boisterous wind more than any enemy. Wakatupu is not famed for war. Inland tribes sometimes pass in trading parties, exchanging paunamu adzes for salted fish and dog-hide cloaks. To Kiri, these visits are exciting interruptions, brief whirlwinds of accents and gestures that scatter new words like seed. Most days, however, carry a gentle sameness. The women weave kete beneath a lean-to, gossiping about headmente wet newly planted gourds. Children practice chants near the cook shelters, stamping dust into rhythm. Carvers sit under a tarred sailcloth awning, coaxing ancestors' faces from totara logs. Kiri's father is among them, chiseling, swirling takarangi that, on completion, will line the interior of a small werinui planned for next winter. Every line remembers a wave, he told her once, tracing a spiral of notches. First you follow the sea, then the sea follows you back. Kiri tucked that phrase away like a shell in her belt. She collected phrases the way some girls collected power chips for pendants. They were tiny stories, each one a paddle stroke across time. Why paint at all? Tools in Wakatupu were not typically decorated. Fishing spears, eel traps, waka paddles, these were work objects, worn until they split and then discarded. Intricate art belonged on werinui walls, on devotional carvings, or on taiaha to honor the warrior holding it. Yet Kiri felt something missing in the plain blade of her paddle, as if an unnamed ancestor wished to speak along its length. She remembered a wakatok her grandmother repeated on foggy evenings. Hikupu ante mona, hikarakia ante inku, a word from the sea, a prayer from the heart. Perhaps paint could be both word and prayer. Already the ochre lines had begun to dry, leaving a subtle glossy skin. She turned the blade slightly, inspecting the kuru. The spiral seemed to breathe against the wood. A second pigment sat in a second. Gourd charcoal, soot mixed with shark oil, yielding an earthy black. With this, she would add the next layer, long ridged waves, each crest echoing pure shells stacked along tide pools. But before the second color touched the paddle, Kiri paused. In the hush she heard paddling slow, sure strokes echoing across. Water. She glanced up. A larger waka, a sleek kihapara craft, glided toward her. A single paddler stood at its stern, cloaked in dogskin for warmth, though morning had already grown mild. His strokes caused hardly a ripple. When he drew nearer, she recognized the visitor, Kaiawio, a traveling takuta healer, known to drift from inlet to inlet, collecting herbs and stories. He lifted an eyebrow at her half-painted paddle. Some would say a silent blade cuts cleanest. He called, voice gentle. Kiri dipped her feather again, unconcerned. And some herbs stink the most before they heal. Kiwia laughed, guiding his waka alongside hers. He examined her work while balancing on his craft with the ease of a gull. Do you paint to ward currents, or to call them? I paint so the river knows I'm listening, she replied, surprised by her own confidence. He nodded, accepting this as perfectly logical. Then his gaze shifted to the unpainted half. There should be stories for both directions, he mused, outgoing tide and returning, leaving shore and coming home. Kiri considered. She had planned a single design, but now imagined two halves speaking to each other. Outbound strokes of red, inbound strokes of black. Dawn journeys, dusk returns. She nodded. I'll try. Kiyoio tapped the side of his hull. Remember, history is a tide too. If you row long enough, you meet yourself coming back. With that cryptic blessing, he paddled on, vanishing into mist. She added his words to her beltful of phrases. Pigments, patterns, and patience. By midday, the sun burned off haze. exposing distant snowy peaks of Tongariro like teeth on the horizon. The inlet shimmered turquoise. Kiri's ochre spiral had dried, firm. She began the black layer-long sinuous lines running parallel down the paddle face, each line ending in a sharp hook reminiscent of a fish jaw. They represented Kai food the paddle would help catch. Between lines she dotted tiny triangles, invoking seabird footprints. The blade became its own map. Spiral equals origin, lines equals journey, triangles equals sustenance. Every few strokes she rinsed the feather in a pottery cup of fresh water, wicking it dry between plaited flax fibers. She hummed quietly, nothing melodic, just the breathy tune of inlet wind. Hours passed. Her stomach eventually grumbled. She unwrapped a small parcel of kumara bread from a leaf and ate while paint set in the sun. With each bite she surveyed her work. The paddle now resembled carvings on war canoes she'd seen once during a coastal gathering, though hers maintained gentler curves, attuned to the hush rather than to battle calls. She remembered Kaiowio's suggestion to stories. 2 directions. The handle remained unpainted. There she would place marks signifying return, semicircles, moons, short cross-hatched dashes rainfall, and shallow grooves representing footpaths back to the village, all in black. Outgoing red, incoming black. Simplicity but balanced. As afternoon waned, she finished the final groove. She blew gently, clearing sawdust. The paddle looked alive. A ripple of consequence that evening. Kira's father inspected her creation. He turned it over under torchlight. Good weight, he grunted. Paint hasn't filled the wood grain, won't weaken in water. He didn't comment on the design. Instead, after a pause, he handed it back. Take it fishing with me before dawn. We'll see if Tangaroa likes your stories. She hardly slept that night, not from fear, but anticipation. Dawn found them, gliding across the inlet, pale light streaking water. Kiri knelt in the bow, her painted paddle dipping, lifting, dipping again. Each stroke sliced water with minimal splashhead. Always been nimble, but now something felt different, as though the paddle knew where the current bent. They reached a customary longline spot. Kiri's father cast baited hooks. They waited. Sea was calm, clouds pinked then golden. After the third line retrieval, nets came up heavy to heavy. Snapper and kahawe glimmered silver red against the waka floor. More than this spot usually yielded. Her father studied her paddle eyes, narrowing in grudging respect. Maybe the stories travel faster than bait, he murmured. News of the catch spread. Neighbors asked to borrow the painted paddle. Some days it returned with meager haul, other days, bounty. Yet each borrower claimed the paddle moved smoother, required fewer strokes. Even skeptics admitted an odd hush followed its waker. Hush not uncomfortable, but attentive, as if unseen watchers lined the water. One moonless night, Kaiowio reappeared. He asked to examine the finished work, running a finger over the grue. The sea inside the would you pick up the paddle again in your thoughts, not to row, but to examine it. Its shaft is worn smooth from years of use, but not in a careless way. The girl who carved it, who held it, knew it would live a long life, perhaps longer than she would. Her name was Haintarangi, and while her story never made the carvings of great warriors or chiefs, it lived in the fine curves of spirals and waves she inked into the wood. Hein was no Torhab, no giant of the sea. She was quiet, small for her age. She sat far back in the waka, rarely speaking when elders talked. but her hands moved constantly, whittling driftwood, knotting flax, drawing the endless kuru spirals in the dust with her toe. As she grew older, her father, who carved for their Iviswaka Tower war canoes, began letting her sweep the wood, shavings from the floor of the carving house. That's where she first noticed the difference in wood grains, how some woods curled like eel tails, and others ran straight like rivers. She learned to listen to the timber, and one winter, when storms made the ocean too angry to fish, she asked her father, "Can I carve my own paddle?" He did not laugh. He only nodded and fetched her a piece of totara light, strong and straight, taken from a log cured in brine and smoke. She bowed her head in gratitude. The wood was stubborn, and she wasn't fast, but her paddle began to take shape at night. She dreamed of it, but not as a tool. She saw it dipped in stars, dragging behind her across glowing water, its blade carved with patterns that shimmered like fish scales. These were not decorations. They were words in a language of swirls, lines, and notches. She asked her grandmother, the village weaver, about these symbols. "Those are koiri, child," she said. "The curving stories. They don't speak to eyes. They speak to the hands, to the skin." So Hein began sketching her dreams with charcoal on the paddle blade. There was the wave she dreamed of riding during a storm, the eye of the tuna fish she caught with bare hands during a dare, the teeth of the shark that circled their canoe and watched her with ancient patience. Each symbol was etched slowly, carefully. Each line bore meaning, not always big stories, but quiet ones. A laugh during a storm, a secret look exchanged between paddlers, the day she first steered a canoe through the mist. But she didn't show it to anyone, not yet. Not until her stories felt settled in the wood. One day, her uncle, a navigator and storyteller, came to the beach while she sat sanding the paddle's handle. He had heard tales of her quiet carving. "Tell me," he asked, sitting beside her, "why do you mark the paddle when it only lives below the water?" She looked at the blade and replied, "Because the sea can read." He was silent for a while, then nodded. "A paddle is not just for direction. It is memory. Carry it well." Word spread of the girl who told stories to the tide. Some came to look. Elders tilted their heads and nodded. Others said nothing, but left small shells or feathers beside her. One child asked if the paddle would help her float to the moon. Hein only smiled, and still she carved. With bone tools she sharpened herself, with patience, with rhythm. One morning, when the sun cut golden paths across the water, Hein was asked to join a real journey. A cousin was to marry into a distant Iwai, and a waka was being sent with gifts, songs, and ceremony. It would be a journey of several days across open sea, past islands she had never seen, under stars she had only heard about. She hesitated. Her paddle was ready, but was she? The night before departure, she laid the paddle beside her sleeping mat and ran her fingers along its edge. She thought of every moment it held, her first solo glide across the lagoon, the splash of dolphins in the bay, the scent of wet flax as she paddled at dawn. The carvings were not perfect, but they were true, and in the stillness of night she whispered to it, not words exactly, just breath, just memory. "Will you carry me?" The paddle said nothing, but the tide outside replied a long, soft sigh against the shore. The quiet stroke of memory, the morning of departure. Mist clung to the low hills. The waka sat on the sand, its prow lifted like the nose of a waiting dog. Hein Tarangi stood quietly with her paddle held upright, the carvings along its blade, still damp from the night air. She pressed her forehead to the shaft for a moment, just once. Before stepping into the canoe, the walker was long and narrow, carved from a single hollowed-out log, its ribs laced with flax and trimmed in black feathers. The sea was calm, a grey, undulating stretch of breathless silence. The journey ahead was not long by the reckoning of seasoned navigators, but for Hein, it was the farthest she had ever been from the place where she first learned to float. Took her position, not near the front, not at the stern, but somewhere in the middle. A place for steady hands, not for leading or steering, but for keeping rhythm. Her job was simple, paddle, but with each dip of her carved blade, she felt her stories slip beneath the surface. The first day passed with little incident. The paddlers moved as one, a chorus of arms and backs and quiet breaths. The wind held its tongue. Even the birds stayed high overhead, their cries faint and unreachable. Every so often, Hina's fingers slid across the symbols carved into her paddle. She did not look down at them, but she felt their presence, like old friends resting nearby. That night, the canoe moored on a tiny island, more sand than soil. Fires were lit, and food was passed around in silence. The older men shared dried fish and murmured stories. The younger paddlers slumped by the fire, shoulders aching. Hein sat apart, her paddle beside her, half buried in the sand to stand upright like a post. It leaned gently in the breeze, as if listening. One of the elder women, whose own hands bore the marks of many years steering great voyages, came and sat beside her. She nodded toward the paddle. "You carry it well," she said. Hein bowed her head. "Does it carry you?" the woman asked. Hein thought a moment, then nodded. "Sometimes, when I am tired." The old woman smiled without showing teeth. "Good paddle will do that. Not push, not pull, just remind." And that night, Hein slept beside it. The second day brought stronger wind. The sea chopped unevenly, like a woven mat being shaken. The paddlers dug harder, their chants louder now. The canoe rose and dipped like a cradle too hastily rocked. Still, the stories on her paddle stayed silent, not in fear but in focus. At mid-afternoon, the sky opened briefly, and sunlight spilled across the water in wide bands. The helmsman called a rest. The paddles were lifted and laid across laps. Hien ran her thumb across the spiral near the top of her blade, the one she had carved for her. Cousins laugh on the day they spotted the twin dolphins. And just then, a dorsal fin broke the water. There, not far from the canoe, a dolphin arced upward, and then another beside it. Hein said nothing, but her cousin, seated 2 rows ahead, turned back and grinned, as if remembering the same day. In that moment, Hien realized the paddle did not just hold her memories, it invited others into them. They reached the distant village the next day. The arrival was quiet, respectful. The walker pulled ashore without ceremony, its crew stiff but uncomplaining. Hein stepped out with her paddle in hand. A group of women welcomed them with soft song and fragrant garlands of seaweed and fern. There would be feasting, speeches, gift-giving. The marriage would take place at sunset, but Hein slipped away, just for a little while, walking to a quiet inlet where the waves lapped at smooth rocks. She knelt beside the water and placed the paddle into the tide. It floated, blade down, bobbing softly. The carvings caught the light as they slipped below the surface. She whispered, "This is yours now, too." And she let the paddle drift just a little, then caught it before it went too far. That night, before sleep, One of the young girls from the host village came to Heine's mat. "I saw your paddle," she said. Hein nodded. "It tells stories." "Yes." The girl hesitated. "Will you show me?" And so, in the flickering firelight, Hein turned the blade over in her lap. She touched each symbol gently, naming it not with words, but with moments. "This one is my grandmother's voice, when she sings before rain. This is the fish that once stole my lunch. This is the path we take around the reef. This is me, when I was too small to paddle, but dreamed I was flying." The girl listened, wide-eyed. She didn't understand all of it, but she didn't need to, because the paddle did not belong to one voice. It belonged to the sea, to the motion, to the memory of quiet strokes across open water, of journeys both long and small, and of those boring, beautiful details that made life float forward. Hein would return home days later. She would carve more paddles, show more girls, let others add their lines. Her own paddle would eventually crack, not in ceremony, not in tragedy, but after years of steady use. It would be laid beside her grandmother's weaving tools and slowly fade into the earth. But even now, perhaps somewhere, a ripple crosses a bay, and no one sees it but a sleeping gull, a faint spiral drifting beneath the surface. Too quiet for a wave, too steady to forget. The weaver girl who waited for the emperor's census, the loom beside the rice field, Jua standing beside a creaking wooden loom, the kind worn smooth by decades of hands, tugging at the shuttle and tightening the weft. Around you, the gentle rustle of wind moves through the rice fields of Han Dynasty China. This is not a grand palace or battlefield. This is the quiet countryside, where life unfolds slowly under a sky that doesn't care much for urgency. The year is 02 CE, and the Han Empire is vast. So vast, in fact, that Emperor Pingberli, more than a boy himself, has authorized the most ambitious national census the world has ever known. Officials are dispatched to count every man, woman, and child in the empire, not for reasons of vanity, but taxation, conscription, grain allotment. The usual concerns of an empire trying to manage its peasants. But this story is not about the emperor. It's about one of the many peasants who waited, patiently, to be counted. Her name was Lin Hua. She was 15 years old, born in a village, so small that even neighboring hamlets mistook it for a shadow of trees. She had never seen a city. She had never seen a horse. She had certainly never seen an emperor. Her entire world was her family's rice plot, the footpath that led to the river, and her mother's loom, which now she operated alone. Lin Hua's mother had died the year before from a lung illness, something not uncommon when winters were damp and wood was scarce. That left Lin Hua with her younger brother and her aging grandmother. She became the weaver, a trade passed from mother to daughter, not by written instruction, but by rhythm and repetition. The tension of the warp threads, the way you flick the shuttle, the exact angle your fingers must bend to, not a hem. She would rise before the sun, just as the rooster finished coughing. The air was still cool then, and dew clung to the edges of leaves like tiny glass beads. Her loom stood under a thatched awning beside the field, where she could keep an eye on her brother while he chased dragonflies, and her grandmother picked wild onions. What Lin Hua wove wasn't elaborate silk or brocade. That was for court ladies and well-fed merchants. She wove hemp cloth, coarse, durable, the kind of cloth that could wrap a child or bind a sprained wrist, the kind of cloth you could trade for a few salted radishes, or, if you were lucky, a duck egg. The census had been the talk of the region for over a year. A rumor made real by the arrival of an official's assistant, One of those literate men with ink-stained fingers and a fondness for reading aloud their own titles. He had visited the nearby village, reciting edicts in a voice so high it startled the chickens. Lin Hua had heard from a peddler that those who weren't counted could be fined or worse, exiled to borderlands where wolves howled louder than children. So she waited. She kept the loom running, counting days by the number of tunics she had finished. But the census takers did not come. Winter turned the rice paddies into hardened slabs of mud. Her brother caught a fever and recovered. Her grandmother's joints stiffened until she could no longer pick herbs from the roadside. And still, Lin Hua waited. She did not dare leave the village in case the census men arrived and marked them as absent. She feared being erased from the records, forgotten by history, even more than they already were. So she began to weave their story into her work. She took scraps of blue-dyed thread from an old ceremonial robe and began to stitch symbols along the edges of the cloth she made, a spiral to mark the wind that kept the birds away, 3 parallel lines for the rows of millet her brother had managed to plant, a crooked square for the cracked clay oven where she baked sweet yam cakes. Her family's history, told in needle and thread in secret, where no tax collector would bother to look. Every week she folded the finished cloth into bundles and stored them in clay jars under the floorboards, waiting for the day anyone would care enough to record her name. Meanwhile, the empire continued its calculations. Over 57 million people were counted by the end of the census, the most extensive demographic record until the 18th century. Scholars in Luoyang patted themselves on the back and discussed grain quotas and military rosters. None of them knew Lin Hua's name. None of them came to her village. But Lin Hua kept weaving, not just out of duty, but out of hope. She believed, somewhere deep in her chest where grief and love shared a home, that to record something even in thread was to make it last, to be seen. The census, after all, would eventually fade, but a story sewn into fabric, wrapped around a newborn, passed from one generation to the next, that might last longer than any emperor's decree. Patterns for the absent officials by the time spring returned to the hills. Lin Hua had finished her 20th tunic. 20 tunics meant roughly 200 days since the rumors of the census had first reached her village. The young bamboo outside her door had grown a foot taller. The wild garlic sprouted again near the brook. The world had not waited for the census men, and neither had Lin Hua's loom. Still, she stayed. To leave would be to risk absence from the record. That thought frightened her more than hunger. In the Han world, you were counted not just for taxes, but for recognition as a subject of the empire. Without your name on the list, you could not marry lawfully, inherit land, or plead your case in court. An uncounted person was a ghost alive in body, but invisible in law. Her brother didn't understand these things. He was only 7, and more interested in finding beetles or asking if ducks could talk. Lin Hua loved his questions, even when they came during the rhythm of weaving and caused her to miss a beat. He had no memory of their mother, and only faint impressions of their father, who had died long before the census was even dreamed up. In that way, the census became their new father figure, an invisible patriarch whose approval they sought from afar. Each evening, Lin Hua lit the lamp with a bit of fish oil and studied her own stitching. What had begun as small decorations became longer bands of pattern. The spiral turned into a stylized cloud. The 3 millet lines curved like waves. She began weaving faint portraits, her grandmother's bent back, her brother's mop of hair, even her own small hands holding the shuttle mid-motion. One morning, while gathering bundles of dry reed for kindling, she overheard two passing farmers speaking of a village up north where the census officials had arrived. One man said they were tall, stern, and carried scrolls as long as fishing nets. The other claimed they wrote with brushes so fine they could scribe on butterfly wings. Lin Hua doubted both descriptions, but listened carefully. The census was crawling toward them, inch by dusty inch. She decided she had to make sure her family would not be forgotten if the officials never came. So she took an old, broad piece of hemp meant to be traded as burial cloth. Than stitched the full story of their household on its surface. She began with the rice field. Green thread, faded from sun, formed rows of young stalks, bent in the wind. Then the house, crooked but warm, with its patchy roof and hollow bamboo beams. Her brother was next, stick-thin legs, always in motion. Her grandmother, seated with a bowl in her lap. And finally, Lin Hua herself, at the loom. The cloth extending from her hands and spiraling out toward the border of the fabric. She added text, not written characters, but pictograms only she understood. A frog for the rainy season when they were sick. A bird's foot for the time a hawk stole one of their chicks. A bundle of 3 dots, always sewn near the top corner. The number of mouths to feed, always 3. It wasn't meant for sale or display. It was a record, her census in thread, a kind of insurance against forgetting. She wrapped it in mulberry paper and tucked it in a jar, sealing the lid with river mud, just in case officials never arrived, just in case no one came. Days passed, then weeks. When the spring festival came and went without word, Lin Hua accepted that the census might not reach her village at all. Yet her weaving did not slow. If anything, it took on new dimensions. She began experimenting with natural dice-crushing berries, boiling bark, soaking roots. She found that pomegranate skins gave a soft gold hue. Indigo leaves, when soaked properly, gave her a dusky blue. Her fabrics became tapestries. Scenes of village life wove into her tunics. Old women carrying buckets, dogs napping by hearths, kites in the wind. Other villagers noticed at first. They just admired the colors, the strange symbols, the way Lin Hua's stitches told stories, without a single word. Then someone asked if she would make one for their family, too. Just a simple one, they said. Just a little record, in case the census doesn't come. So she did. An old couple who'd never had children asked her to weave their ox and their favorite mango tree. A widow asked for the image of her late husband, just his nose and chin, the way I remember them. Even the village headman, skeptical at first, asked for a small band of cloth with his 8 chickens stitched in a line. He said he wanted to be remembered as the man who always had too many eggs. Lin Hua's loom became not just a tool of survival, but of memory, of presence. They were no longer waiting for officials with long scrolls and fine brushes. They were writing their own senses with needle and thread, in the quiet language of woven symbols. Each stitch was a protest against erasure, a mark of existence in an empire too vast to care for every village, every name. They may not have been counted in the emperor's grand tally, but within their stitched world, every soul was accounted for. The emperor's men arrive after Olit was the 297th day since the first whispers of the census had reached Lin Hua's village. She knew because she'd marked each one on a thin strip of leftover reed paper tucked under her pillow. The notches looked like the legs of a centipede, long, regular, quietly crawling across the year. By now, the waiting had become ritual. Each morning she stirred the millet, stretched the cloth on the frame, and checked the road leading in from the east. She no longer expected the officials, but habit made her look anyway, just in case. That afternoon, as the rice boiled over the edge of the pot and her brother chased a dragonfly near the fence, she saw them, 2 men, dressed in dark robes, mounted on sturdy horses. One held a long lacquered box across his back. The other led a mule laden with scrolls and brushes and bundles of red ribbon. They did not look particularly regal or mysterious. They looked dusty, tired, sweaty, and slightly annoyed that no one was waiting to greet them. The village, stunned, emerged from their homes as if from hibernation. Children gawked. Old men whispered, "Are they really census men?" The taller of the 2 confirmed it with a nod and a sigh, and removed a small clay seal from inside his sleeve. It bore the mark of the Emperor's Office of Population Records, though it looked to Lin Hua more like a tortoise eating a plum. The census had come at last, but it was clear the officials were overwhelmed. This was their 84th village in the province. Their inkstones were chipped. Their maps had holes from too many folds. The mule had begun refusing to walk if its load shifted even slightly. One by one, the villagers stepped forward as names were collected, ages approximated, and relationships untangled. Lin Hua was called last. She stepped forward with steady feet and a roll of woven cloth in her arms. Not to prove her identity, but because, out of instinct, she wanted them to see what had already been done. The shorter official, barely older than she was, blinked at the tapestry. "These are your records." "Mine," Lin Hua said, "and the villagers." She unrolled the cloth on the flat stone bench by the headman's door. The images told the stories, births, deaths, seasonal changes, even the old man's chickens. The official's brush hovered in the air, unsure what to do. "I didn't know what questions you'd ask," she said gently, "so I tried to answer all of them." The official didn't laugh. He stared longer than she expected. Then carefully, he dipped his brush into the little ink pot and began to copy not just the names, but the symbols too. He even asked her what the frog meant, and the cluster of 3 dots. For a moment, it seemed the Emperor's census had expanded to include the language of weavers. After the officials left, the villagers buzzed with stories of how they'd finally been counted, how their names were now riding on horseback, headed for the capital, nestled among scrolls like silkworms in cocoons. It was as if, by being written, they had become more real, more permanent. Lin Hua felt no such transformation. She had always known she was real. But that evening she took her reed paper centipede of days, rolled it up, and set it beside her oldest tapestry. Her counting was finished. Her waiting was done. From then on, her weaving became something new. She made fabrics that held only dreams, gardens where the moon bloomed like a flower, or rivers that carried boats made of candles and song. She stitched stars with thread soaked in walnut dye. She sewed birds that flew across the seams of blankets, their wings half hidden unless you unfolded them just so. One day her brother asked, "What story is this one telling?" Lin Hua looked at her newest cloth, deep olive green, streaked with cloud-pale spirals. "It's not a story," she said, smiling. "It's a wish." He blinked. "Can a wish be stitched?" "I think," she said, gently threading the needle. Again, that a wish is just a story waiting to be counted. And so she wove not for officials, not for scrolls or seals, but for the quiet record of things that matter, even when no one is watching. In a tiny village, that the empire almost forgot. Every thread still held a name, a memory, a moment. And the census of the heart, once started, never truly ends.